In this video, I'm going to describe a technique that you can use to inject originality into your designs, whether it's character designs, whether it's a background. And I call it art snapshots, mental snapshots. So that sounds a little bit weird at first, but you'll see as I go along. It's a nice rainy night here in Toronto, and I just went for a walk before it got dark. And I got to thinking about this as I was walking along, that success in drawing doesn't just come from the final act of making a drawing on paper or digitally, as I'll show here. I'm going to do a demo in a second. It's really what happens before that. And in fact, you can, excuse me, you can train your memory and your drawing skill when you're not even drawing. Like if you don't have pencil and paper with you, or you don't have a digital tablet, you can do all kinds of things to really stock your memory, and that'll come into play later when you sit down to draw. And I call it taking mental snapshots. And again, to repeat, it sounds a bit weird when you don't understand what I'm talking about, but you know, you're not sitting there like clicking your eyes at things because you'd be perceived as a weirdo. But it's about observation. There was a famous drawing school called the Famous Artist School back, I think, in the 50s, and it had a correspondence course. And I think it actually had a school. I'm not sure, but I think it had a school at one point. And it was composed of very famous illustrators like Norman Rockwell, Albert Dorn, a whole bunch of others, Robert Fawcett. And in fact, there's even art books that you can get, perhaps even download. But they had a motto which went, see, observe, and remember. And that really, I think, got into what I'm going to be talking about here, is that, again, creating a piece of art isn't just the actual moment of the literal act of drawing. It's a whole process. And so what reservoir do you draw from when you are drawing? Like, it's from your memory, and it's from your mind. And it's even from your memory, even if you have something right there, like a photo, and there's just only a moment from when you look at it and you go and draw. There's still a gap. So it's really coming from you. Even if you trace something, you're still hopefully trying to add something to it. And if you don't, which is what I'm going to get into with this, if you don't add much to it, it's kind of dead. So it's really, no matter what, coming from you. Now, usually people turn to things like photos, but a photo alone will not give you the actual act of creation where you synthesize and you put it all on the paper. You know, you have to kind of be willing to face that moment. It's the act of creation and engaging with it. So what I'm describing here is a technique that you can do even when you're not drawing that will augment that process. It'll give you something to draw from, whether you realize or not. You will see when you try this that it really does help. So it means active seeing instead of passive. So when you go out for a walk or something, like I said, I was just out shopping and I was looking around. Normally we get bored and you just get used to thinking that you've seen everything there is to see. So you see something called a tree because you've been taught, oh, that's a tree. So you glance over, tree, and you see a rainy street, oh, rainy street. Seen it all before hundreds of times, the older you get. But really, what you need to do as an artist is shake yourself out of that and see with new eyes, the way a little kid would, or a newly arrived being on this planet that's never seen any of this stuff before. And try and find unique things that you haven't noticed before and try and remember them. And I'm going to do my best to demonstrate this, because I was thinking as I was walking, well, you have to be good for your words, Paul, and you know, all these theories. You have to actually explain to people that you're trying to do this too. And I have for many years. And any success I've had, I think, comes partly from this. And it means simply taking mental notes. You know, like if you're in a classroom and you have a teacher talking about theories of science or whatever, mathematics or history, you're sitting there taking notes. At least people used to when I went to school, which was a long time ago now. But I think that the techniques that they explained were good ones. They're memory techniques. It was explained to me, I think, even by a couple of brilliant teachers I had in high school. There were a few. And one of them said, if you put it into your mind only once by listening to me talk, that's not good enough. If you have to hear what I say, understand it, and then turn it into a note and write it down, you've done two more things. Turned it into your own concept, explained it to yourself in your own words, and then you've written it down in a book or whatever it is, your notebook. And then that's going to stick it in your memory more, and then it's going to come back out later. So when I got to studying art on my own, I decided to start doing that. And this idea that I'm going to be explaining here is kind of an extension of that. It's not only explaining to yourself, but taking notes. So I started doing that in different sketchbooks and things, like literal notes in sketchbooks. But then I also started experimenting with this technique. So it's an extension of note-taking in school and even note-taking in art, is visual note-taking when you're out walking and you don't have the materials. Like I was carrying shopping bags and stuff. I took a bunch of iPhone photos, which I'll show you in a few minutes, or near the tail end of this. And you can take photos too, like there's endless ones. You can take your own photos. There's obviously a drowning sea of visual information and photos on the internet, Google search away. So, that in itself can become a kind of problem because you need a basis on which to filter. But what I always do when I work on projects, and I always have to mention Alex Toth at least once, but in one of his postcards, he advised me as being he was kind of a mentor. And for the people that don't know him that might stumble across this video, a famous comic book artist, Alex Toth, T-O-T-H, and he said, because I asked him, how do you create? Do you draw directly from photos? And he said, no, he looks at lots and lots of photos and then put them all away. And I learned to do that because you can get kind of crippled like by visual information. It's better to stock it into your memory and then just put it away and not worry about it and draw. And you might go back later and maybe use one more carefully for some details. But the idea is that in the act of creation, where it's a synthesis out of thin air, out of your mind, like a cool cover design or whatever, or a background setting, you have to be able to get to that point where you just sit down and tackle it yourself and you bravely face it and you start working with the elements, moving them around. And this is where this note-taking can come into play very, very well. So I'm going to switch over to my Photoshop here and see what I can do. Hang on, I've got to switch my screen here, people. So I think I'll do it this way. I'll do full screen. And that's my Photoshop, but it's very small. So we'll get it to be large and bright. And all right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you some examples of, as I said, I was trying to be true to my word. I've got my cursor here. I like it better like that. Trying to be true to my word and take notes on my walk and then draw things that I remembered. And you only remember them if you make a point of noticing them. So I jogged myself out of the usual stupor. Oh, it's a rainy day and I'm going shopping, which I don't mind, but you can just walk along glumly in the rain and kind of just be another person plodding along. Or you can go to yourself, hey, I'm an artist. I really enjoy looking at things. I want to see beauty and interesting combinations. And that's what I did. And I'll do these as they come to mind. Like, I remember walking along, and there was one of those bolted kind of, and I don't pretend to memorize these perfectly, but where they have a street sign. It's a big concrete pole, and it's bolted down. Sometimes there's an extra thing it sits on, sometimes not. And then as I walked by, I just made my observations like, oh, there's an extra pipe over here. And I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. And these are the things that add extra value to your designs. I use this constantly, this sort of approach. I was the key background designer for robotdreams, the feature film. So when I came to doing backgrounds, I was always thinking, without going overboard, if I could find places to add little extra things, because they add character. Because a background is a character with a whole history, just the same as a person is, young, old. Our histories are written on our faces, and the histories of settings are written in the backgrounds all around us as we walk by. And if you learn to see what it is and decode it, it makes it much more interesting. So in this case, there's leaves in this empty pipe. And, you know, my view is actually down more, but I'll add a couple here. This empty pipe, because it's autumn here in Canada, there's all kinds of oak leaves on the streets. There is like a street here, the edge of a street, a curb on the street, and all kinds of leaves in the gutters. So I noticed, isn't that interesting? It's filled up with leaves, this like dead pipe that they had cut off. It might have even had some threads on it, I can't remember, but see, that's about memory, right? So the whole thing's about memory. Like if I'd stopped longer and memorized it better, I would have been able to add that. But that's like an observation. And then there's at a separate place, this is a different drawing, there is another kind of pole, one of those angled poles. It's like angle iron, and it's got drilled holes, which is not really my point here. But it looks like it had been installed long ago. It was again near the edge, and it looks like maybe something had run into it, or perhaps it had, the forces of nature had played on it after a while. Because what it had quite unusually is it had a whole bunch of radiating cracks coming out from it, like this. And from the point of, well, that if that was like a spear, that would be the point of impact. But this was just a pole in the ground, so I'm thinking maybe somebody wobbled it, maybe somebody ran into it, you know, with something. Here, I'm going to actually switch my layout. And, oops, I'm not doing this properly. Just bear with me. Here we go. I've returned. So, going back to this, that was another observation. And then a third one, as I was walking, I was trying to stack these in my head as much as possible. This is my little art ruler, by the way. It's a good tip for if you're working on it. I've got a Cintiq drawing screen, but to draw lines without scratching it, I just made this cheapo ruler with a plastic wood ruler, and I glued felt in the back, which is now well worn. It's my little friend, so I can quickly draw rule lines, straight lines. Maybe I shouldn't have given that away and pretended to be perfect. Anyway, so trying to remember where I was going to go with that. Yes, these are just incidental observations. They're not in any particular connection, but they're the kind of things you can put in your memory and use for later so that you don't draw cliched stereotype things and that you give a sense of life. So I remember walking by a store, and it had a mat, one of those rubber mats in the rain, but the edge had curled up. So it was like one of these rubber mats where you put them outdoors. And it had a whole bunch of leaves kind of stuck around it or behind it. And that's not, the greatest thing ever, but it's just a bit of interesting character, right? There was another one, which you'll see in a photo, of a lintel, sort of a concrete, I don't know if that's the right word, lintel. There's a concrete thing, and then there's earth, which you'd have to symbolize, in cartooning form, like, I don't know if that looks completely like earth. And it has like dead weeds and stuff. You'll see this in one of the photos I show, if I do manage to get to it. And then there's just a good old coffee cup set there. Now, again, this is not earth-shaking, but somebody had sat down and abandoned their, Tim's, whatever it was, Tim's coffee thing. And these things all give character. Like, you can pop things like that. And, stray paper, abandoned little items. I made some notes here. I guess that's a cheat, but I think that's pretty well the things that I remember from my walk. One more. All right. This was interesting. Oh, two more, actually. It has to do with cracking. So there's these concrete seams that were like a sidewalk. If you picture a sidewalk like this, like it's just like that. And there's these concrete edges that they'd built, the city had built. But one of them had cracked away, I guess from the winter. and it had actually kind of rotated out. So I got to erase this. And it kind of shifted and rotated down like that. So it was all, it was deteriorating. It was like on the way. So I don't know what had happened. Maybe something had hit it again. But this again all gives interest. If you learn to draw backgrounds or anything with the famous 3D assets, or just trace a photo that isn't that interesting a photo, you might not think of value-added stuff like this, but that's what you need. Is like you're creating it. You take the reins, and if it's appropriate to the setting and the situation that you're doing, try and think of things that give it life, like as if you are actually there in real life, even if you're making some completely imaginary drawing. But just like if you do figure drawing from real figures instead of copying anatomical diagrams, which can be useful, it's a stage, but you also need to go and look at real people just the way they really are with your own two eyes. So in the same way, for learning to draw backgrounds, you need to actually draw from or memorize, which is the main point of this video, memorize things that you see as you're going around, particularly unique or charming or quirky things that are combinations of elements that give a real character. So the last thing I'm going to say in this section of my talk here is upheaval. Like I saw a piece of, the pavement, and it had heaved up. So actually I'm going to erase that. I'll go back a bit. Let's do it this way. I think this is, because I'm trying to remember the view that I actually saw. I used my friend the ruler here. Right, it was, the ground had actually subsided. Just erase that. So one of the pieces of concrete had shifted down. So now you had this plane of this concrete dropping here. You had a little edge. And it wasn't as big as I've made it here. But what was interesting to me was the wind had gathered all the leaves and sludge. There's this kind of like autumn sludge here on the ground, and now it's all wet and rainy. But it's like a mass of leaves that are, kind of decomposing. And you can see individual leaves that have blown on top. But this is like all this grimy sludge. It's almost like turning into soil. But what it had done is it had gathered here. If you see where I'm drawing up here in the corner, it had gathered against, by the wind, pushing it against this little edge. So that's like a natural formation. In the same way you would see, like in the street, because of the wind and the water flowing down the street, like say here's a drain. This is another thing I actually saw. See, the more I talk about this, the more it comes back to me. And in fact, what you discover is if you do this consciously with intent, you get better at it, and you can, as weird as it sounds at first and maybe as difficult, you learn that you can actually start stalking these things and remembering them. And then, of course, it helps you later, as I said, when you create. But in the same way as these leaves gathered here, you're going to see leaves and sludge gathering away from the street, because often streets are slightly curved. They put it like a dome on them so the water will drain if it's well built. It's very subtle. So the water will drain there off and push all the stuff to the sides and gather against this edge of the this edge here where the sidewalk is, because I've drawn this like looking from above. So you've got this stuff gathering, and then what I remember noticing too here is that a lot more of this had gathered because there was some stuff that had clogged this part of the drain, because the gaps here were not that thick. So it had clogged the drain, and then you had this building back. And again, that's an example. These are all things to do with like leaves and streets, because that's where I was walking. But if you went to exotic locales or different places, it depends on where you live and what you observe. If we're talking about direct observation, then you're only going to be able to directly observe the kind of things in the kind of place that you live. So if you lived in a tropical climate, you're going to see, I don't know, palm trees and crashing surf or something. But that's, whoops, hey, don't leave me now. Well, actually you can, because I'm going to go on to the next one. Yeah, so it depends on where you live, is what I was saying. So here's a drawing I did quite a while ago in the 90s, 1990. And this was not a observation of an actual place, of course, but it was based on this kind of idea of walking around. I lived in Germany at the time, actually, in Munich, which was fun. So I lived there for a year, and I remember walking around. Now, this is not based on German idioms or whatever you call it, the style of architecture, but it was very visually interesting, all the different buildings, and I guess it stimulated me. So it got me thinking along the same lines of, looking at stuff, being visually inspired, and then I would come home and just make up these sketches trying to combine different elements. And when I look at this now, I see some drawing mistakes and things, but it was meant to be a wonky style drawing where I did it straight ahead with a pen and a sketchbook and really didn't worry about exact perspective. But I was more thinking about combinations. Like if you look down here where the cursor is, I was trying to challenge myself, I think, as much as I remember doing this, of like unusual windows here, or here in one of the steps has got a window of some kind. You've got garbage bins put under the staircase. This would be the remains here of some kind of holder of a sign, maybe. There's some kind of door buttons. And this is a very tiny door, so I don't know what kind of creature would fit in there. But the idea is to put functional elements and try and find unusual combinations to give it some kind of charm. And here, because it's kind of semi-science fiction-y, fantasy, I was trying to think of making things look more unusual. So here I put some kind of opening under this little step. The garbage can has got some kind of metal pipes or things that are not put into the garbage can. And I suppose that this is probably inspired by things that I must have seen, or quirky things on a walk back then in Germany, but maybe not directly, but it got me thinking along those lines. I can't remember now, it was a long time ago. Here I made a cutout because I was thinking, a manhole, it's right in front of the door for whatever reason, and then they've cut out the steps because they still need access. So maybe for some reason they had to have a manhole there, but they also had to have steps so that you intersect the two and you get this unusual setup, which of course would be very bad for people walking. You're going to trip or whatever, but that's the kind of thing, though, you see in real life. If you walk around, you see that everything's been retrofitted or patched, or sometimes people run cables over other cables. I'm going to go on to another one here. This is a drawing I did in a sketchbook, again along similar lines, where it's built on observations of things and the way they work. And then you just freelance and just free rein yourself, just start drawing. So I'm thinking of cables, I'm thinking of vents here at the top. There's all kinds of vents. That's based on, if you walk around and look up, and you're in a commercial district and you see different restaurants, they might have all sorts of funky styles of vents and for the food stuff, the fumes or whatever. But here I started, it's like a springboard. I started building from things that I saw in real life and then just go from there. And I added a bunch of extras, trees. I'm trying to remember what I was thinking of here, just anything. I'm pretty sure that it was sort of anything to make it unusual or interesting. So you've got like cables, and there's a hook here. There's a suggestion of some kind of open window or propped up rain shelf on a window. There's blinds. You know how when you get blinds here, there's blinds here, but you know how when you get blinds and you pull them askew, and they're all like on an angle. So that's what I've got in that window. And there's some kind of maybe air conditioner or vent here, and it's been probably is breaking, or the plaster's fallen off. So there's some wood that's been nailed on or screwed on there. There's some issues here in this drawing, maybe with the scale of things, because that's a really tiny door. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. This is just an exploratory sketch. There's like some kind of remnants of mesh fencing, or maybe there's mesh along this whole fence for some reason, railings, but they took it away. I remember when I did this, what I do remember of it is just slathering as many things as I could think of. This was an attempt to show, when you get bricks and then they plaster over bricks, that makes interesting combinations of textures and patterns. But here is where, based on observations when you walk around, that they will take sometimes vents and or electrical conduits, and they'll sometimes put them here because of the weather, inside a metal pipe, and then sometimes even wrap that with a plastic or sheet metal kind of covering. And then here, I use that kind of idea to suggest that. And again, it gives them more character, because these things I'm all looking for here is characters, like unique things. It's like the weathered lines in a person's face. It betrays character. Posture, clothing on people betrays character. Not betrays, it reveals. Well, betrays is another way of saying it. Here's some cracks around this window. There, cracks will usually develop around stress places, or places where the original surface has been impacted or drilled into or changed. Like I said, with that pole, there was a stress force, so cracks radiate out naturally from that stress. Here's, probably retrofitted pipes, that metal cables that they've stuck onto the wall, and then they're radiating out or tapped into from this original power source, which you see all the time on buildings, that the building's built, but they need more power, so they run some power lines on the outside and, just retrofit it around things like windows or protrusions the best they can. I'll go to another drawing here. So this one I called Sky Fishing, and it's just a whimsical drawing of a little floating island, and there's a little cottage nestled in against this tree. There's a little, not really a story, but there's a little deduction, the person's come to visit their little remote island. They've got this kind of strange little vehicle, and it's anchored by a little line there. There's a deck that maybe they hop down onto. And then if you gently, you drift down here eventually, you're going to see there's a little character down here, fishing with a fishing pole of some kind, and we don't see what he's fishing because it's off screen. But I'll go full screen here for a minute, just to, am I full screen? Yes, I am. Maybe I'll make this drawing up. No, I'll leave it this way. So when I examine this drawing, I'm thinking of the different elements I put in. And they're, again, based on this kind of thinking, because really the whole purpose of these kinds of videos I'm making is not to give people rigid formulas. It's to explain a kind of thinking where you can take that thinking, because it's free for anybody, and develop your own way of doing it. So it's not a matter of just saying, hey, when you draw, a spaceship, draw exactly this. Here's my formula. Where you draw an arm, just draw this loop and this bump, and then just till kingdom come, draw that. No, what you need to understand is the principles of things. And then you can use that and put your own particular stamp on it, your own individual stamp. So what I'm talking about here as a principle is giving some individuality to settings by looking for unique, quirky things, looking for functional elements, and looking to give some kind of believability. Like, for example, here, as I drew this, I was thinking, it sort of evolves on its own. Like, most of these are kind of straight ahead drawings, but as I draw each piece, I'm trying to think about what would really be there if I was really there, and what can I do to make it believable, to kind of sell it. So, and to make it fun and interesting and unique. So here, for example, I guess they built this cottage around this tree, or maybe the tree went through it, but probably not, because you can see that here where my cursor is, the top step has been carved around the tree, like the roots of it, which then go down into the ground. And you can see this kind of thing in real life. Like, I've seen fences where, in photos and also in real life, I forget where I was, but it wasn't that long ago, they had built to accommodate this existing tree, they had actually built a fence and a structure to allow it to pass through, and that's really cool. It's kind of like a respect for nature. So I was implying a similar thing here. They built this little cabin. They supported it with some stonework. The tree passes through. They've got a railing, which is a functional element. You need something to hold on to. There's other functional elements, like there's a little drain pipe here. It's not that clear in the drawing, but it's like dripping. And there's some kind of funky little tower on the side with smokestacks. There's I'm having a brain fart, because I guess that's, a compass that's in the wind. Why does my brain not? It's aging brain, people. Anyway, you know what I mean. It's there's a word for that. But because I'm making a video, compulsion compels me to just keep moving. Um, a flagpole I thought would be interesting, you know, blowing in the wind gives a little bit of action. Then you go down here and you see other functional elements, like they built this cottage and they needed either a drain or a vent over here. So this is like it could be like a poop waste chute. No, I guess not, because it wouldn't be like that. It would be more vertical, just dropping down. Maybe that's what this one is here. As gross as that is, I don't know. But it's some kind of vent, you know, it could be wastewater, let's call it. And this could be an air intake of some kind, we don't know. And it's because it would be too wobbly without support, they've quite industriously added a string to tie it. It probably needed more. And this root has grown through at some point, and it's kind of tapering off. Then we've got our friend down here. He's on this deck. Doesn't have much safety to it. There's a bunch of cables. There's a lantern here for lighting, because whenever you design an environment, if you want it to feel like it's functional and lived in, you're thinking about things that humans would do to direct their activities. Or even if you like drawing aliens or monsters, you think like, how would an alien or monster design their environment? But usually it's things like lighting, it's pathways, it's openings and closings, you know, doors, it's signage to direct people. It's all the elements like that that you think of installing. And then if you can think of an interesting way to show that clearly, you're going to be on the roadway to creating an interesting environment. Like here, I've got a little trap door, so it's probably not that clear in the drawing, but probably if I colored this, I could make it a little clearer. But there's a little lever thing here that's the sort of control arm for the trapdoor, and it implies that this little Alfie character can wiggle his way down this tunnel and drop down. Maybe there's steps or a circular staircase, who knows, inside there, and then drop down the last thing for their little deck here because they're sky fishing. So moving on to the next one, this is a guy, I called him Thronk. But it's again just a sketchbook drawing, and he's like a new dude in town, was my theory, which is not that obvious from the drawing, but he's got an interesting combination of elements. And I was thinking he's some kind of alien unicorn, which is very odd, but he has some kind of horn here, but it's broken, and he's taped it up with cable, and who knows why. He's got their very small, some kind of baseball cap. You know, it's a techno baseball cap. He's almost got like a scarf, but it's almost like a dinner napkin on his neck. Sometimes these things are just odd, and when you do straight ahead drawing, they just emerge. Again, from things you've seen sometimes. And he's got some kind of clipped on belt. You know, are they magazines for a weapon? Who knows? And he's got some kind of electronic briefcase here. Because I remember thinking, like, don't just draw an ordinary briefcase. If you're doing sci-fi or fantasy things, it's like, make it interesting or odd, but try and make it believable at the same time. So I've got a handle. I've got stickers like he's been traveling. That implies history and story. A cable of some kind. Maybe it's like, I don't know, refrigerated. I think I've got some papers here sticking up. I've got knee pads on this guy here, like he's got reinforced knees. He's got big old rubbery boots. I was thinking of like rubber rain boots, you know, with those big old treads. But again, it's this kind of thing. It's using things from real life, but just repurposing them and throwing them into a drawing and trying to create a sense of reality, like an integrated reality that makes some kind of coherent sense to people. And to that end, you know, here I've got bars on the, I've got bars on the window. I've got, you know, cracked window, and I've got lights. I've got another little window in this archway, because I remember thinking, or drawing this, it was too boring by itself, so I thought, I'll just do a line there and then add a window in. This next one was a background for Warner Brothers, I think, for one of the shows. And it wasn't the usual fantasy sci-fi stuff, but it might have been Justice League, I don't remember, but it was like an abandoned kind of exhibition or carnival. And or it might have even been Batman Brave and the Bold. Memory fails me here, but it was like a circusy carnival type thing. not that elaborate, but again, I was using some very simple, similar ideas of observations like here, the weeds growing where the cracks are along the edges of the cracks. And because it was supposed to be abandoned, so you immediately think, oh, I've got to throw in some deadness, weeds and crack stuff. And of course, all of them are empty. And again, I was thinking of things like steps, cables over here, believable elements, but not overly complex. More cables here. And it's again all stuff from walking around, just looking at stuff and trying to put it in your memory. I'll go to my next one, which is, I called this one Stable Kids, and it was these little kid characters, and they've got some kind of animal that they're taking care of. So they're, doing their dutiful duties. And again, it was the thing of just inventing an environment and trying to make it interesting, make it fun, and make it believable. There's maybe some wider garage or something out here where maybe vehicles could move, so I left that kind of empty. Also because I didn't want to make it overly busy. There's a sign here, implies that right away that there's lots more of them, so that intrigues you. It's like, well, what else is around the corner? And then there was all kinds of elements I was thinking of as I was drawing this, like, okay, you're taking care of this animal who's barely roped in, but it's it's a little grumpy looking but friendly still, and it's used to this, so it's going along. Kids up here, I don't know how he got up there. Probably the other one would have had to help him. They've got some kind of hose. I guess they're going to wash down the animals. This little guy is scrubbing. He's got some kind of vacuum cleaner scrub brush type thing. There's hay or some kind of material put down on, like they do in like a horse stable. A drain here. There's a little ramp to help little snubby creature here get up and down the ramp. And I was constantly thinking of make it believable, like again, to sell it to people. Because if you don't think of these kind of details, then it probably won't fly. And there's a sort of threshold where if you get enough of them, it starts really having more life. I mean, Miyazaki immediately comes to mind as I'm talking about this. The thing that's so appealing about his films is that he goes that extra level, or 3 or 4 levels further, of creating really realistic, believable environments. And the people who work with him are all brilliant too. They're all on that same wavelength of, he doesn't just draw some generic background. He makes it feel lived in. He gives it realistic components and realistic structure. And again, it's almost like you project yourself into it and say, what would actually be there for this to work? And is this a realistic thing I'm doing? Like, oops, I've moved it with my cursor. Curses. Here, there's like water pipes. So there's a shut-off valve here. There's cracks again. I always like that one with the bricks revealed behind, so it shows that there's a history. Things have been plastered. There's a ladder here that stops mysteriously here, but you can get up to some kind of upper level. There's a storage drum. It looks like an oil drum down in the corner, and over here there's at the bottom there's some kind of machinery that's unknown. This could be storage of maybe food. There's a little stool down here in the corner. And that reminds me to say that even if you're doing a science fiction environment, if you can create recognizable things, they have to be similar enough to things that so you can say, oh, that's a stool. Like you could say, oh, an alien stool is just a sphere floating there in space, but no one's going to say, oh, that's an alien stool. You have to give people an access point or an entryway visually that they can actually understand, oh, it's a stool, but it's different. Now this stool isn't that different. This could be a real world one, but I'm just explaining something that came to mind, is that when you design stuff, even if it's exotic, you have to make it visually recognizable, but monkey around with it, which is where the interest can come in. So here I had some bins. This could be slop or food for the animal with a handle. There's some kind of coiled up stuff here. It could be rope or another kind of hose maybe that goes in one of these outlets over here. There's some smaller containers or jars of stuff. Who knows what that is? But again, it's interesting. There's a storage chest here, and it's again labeled 5. So, and then there's a network up here of pipes that are doing something. But again, that all creates interest, right? Like, what do they do? It's going somewhere. So I'll go on to the next one. We're kind of tapering down here. This is from my art principles on Instagram at art principles, Instagram/art principles. People can find more. It's like a repository, more of these notes, but this is a screenshot I took from one of them. And I'm not going to read all this right now in this video. People can go over and look at it. But here I was talking about the idea that links to the previous one with the stable, that you can create lots of new ideas by experimenting with variations, and you make variations on combinations of different elements. So here, for example, even with a simple door and an air conditioner and a staircase, which I didn't put in all three of them, but here in this top left one, I was thinking, how can you make it different? Like you put an air conditioner below, here it's in a recessed little nook beside the door, here it's just to the upper left of the door, here it's above the door, which you often see. And it again, it depends on the realities of the situation, but in real life you see all kinds of things like this. Like you can take endless photos as you walk around. Like I said, I'll probably show some of my photos. Maybe I'll save this part for the end, but I'll show some photos. These are some notes I took. Notes I made mentally in my head as I was walking, and then I wrote these down before I made this video. And I'll probably recap it for more of a classroom type thing. But here, let's present the. Hang on, I'm going to go back here to change my. Actually, no, I think I'll keep it on this because it'll probably present these better. These are drawings I have drawings. These are photos I took just today as I was walking home. The sun was setting. There's a very nice light through the clouds, and again, it'll give examples of what I'm talking about. And anyone can do this. And if you learn to do this actively and purposefully, you know, of course, people will think you're a weirdo. I do occasionally get glances because it's that thing where like I'm walking along, I stop with my groceries, I get my iPhone out, and I'm taking a photo of the drain, and someone's walking by, they're kind of glancing at you because they're thinking, you can tell they're thinking, why is that dude taking a photo of the drain? Like, wow, is that a super drain? Is something going to come out of it? But no, I'm taking this photo of this drain because it's so interesting when you approach it from this standpoint. You know, you've got leaves that are, like, this is where I got that idea of the stuff gathered. It's kind of clogging up and building up here. So, you get this buildup because it's slowly getting clogged. If you've got a bigger storm going on, you'd probably have this whole thing clogged up and sometimes flooding. But, they've cut this metal piece into the ground, and they've got there's a little triangle of these square bolts or whatever they are. There's the pattern. There's the cracking paving stones here. There's random twigs that have landed in on top. There's the stamp that they put when they make these. I can't read what it says, but often these concrete companies, they have their own little stamp that they put on some of them pieces of work that they do. I've seen them do it with a little metal thing. They stamp it into the concrete as it's drying. So I'll go through some of these maybe a little quicker, but this is a similar thing, the leaves gathering. There's these, I'm not sure if this is for the blind or if it's for ice build up in the winter, but there's these bumpy things they've installed with the kind of raised rivets. And maybe for the blind to know where they're crossing. I'm not sure. I'm sure somebody in the comments will know. I'm using all of these as examples of don't just look and let it swarm over you. See, active seeing. And the things are all around. Like there's endless things. So I couldn't possibly elaborate them all in a video, but I'm just saying that these are all things you can use later and repurpose. Like instead of an ordinary sign, they had some kind of plastic here in this sign. I think that's why I took this photo. And it's all been torn off. There's some kind of, I don't know if that's like a gas pipe outlet. I don't really know what that is, but it's sticking up out of the ground. Of course, some trash here, fallen leaves. And that's about it for that one. But, well, except I guess I'll point out here, they sodded this. I've watched this through the fall. They sodded this, but I guess too late, so it never properly grew in. And then winter came, so you've got this dead grass here. Probably in the spring it'll come back to life, but here's just a close-up of that same one, torn plastic. And again, if you were designing a sign yourself in a scenario for a background design, You might not throw all of these things in, and again, like I said earlier, unless it was appropriate and it fit the setting. But there are ways that you can find variations or unique stuff. Here, of course, you've got graffiti. You've got a brand new fire hydrant that they installed. It's kind of above ground, so it's on this weird little stalk, which is odd. And a manhole here that's been, I think, painted over. It's blending in very well, but I'm pretty sure that's a manhole. If you look back here, you've got like some kind of, I don't know if that's abandoned, if that's like an old air conditioner that's just on its side in front of this. Can't really see clearly. I think I took another photo trying to figure it out, but I was moving, so this one's a little out of focus. Stuff gathered, dead sod. Lots of interesting details around doorways if you want to design entranceways. You've got functional elements. There's the register, or the again, my brain is failing me. Where you'd buzz in, the list of names if the door's locked. Interesting fences. Again, a foggy picture because it was raining and I was walking. But regardless, sometimes foggy ones are even better. You've got leaves piled up against the chain link fence here. It's been left open. That's interesting. Big old apartment building. You notice that the alignment of the different poles is not always vertical. The fence is a bit off, so you don't have to make everything vertical. Put things out of alignment. You see how they're all shifting a bit? It's because of nature and like the winter, the frost, whatever, wind. People bump into things, pipes get bent. Don't make everything just perfect because it's boring. Here you've got dead plant in the winter left in the entranceway to this one building. You've got very crude piped railings. I guess they didn't want to go full hog and spend the money. You've got gas meter. You've got retrofitted electrical here on the outside. You've got a vent here. You've got some kind of stain up here above the window. Is that like a kamikaze bird that hit above the window? I really don't know, but there you go. Let's move on because I got lots of these people. They're all interesting, really. When you think about it as like actively looking, you're like looking to extract the juice from it. Things that you could use later where you go, I could use that for my design. And sometimes when you're working on something, if you go out in the world, there's a kind of serendipity where things come to your aid and they jump out and say, oh, well, that's the perfect thing I need for my design. When I worked on Robot Dreams, that was happening all the time. I was walking around or, doing errands or whatever, and I'd see something and say, oh, I can use that for this scene I'm working on. Again, interesting entranceways, stepping down, different painted colors on the concrete, older buildings, so they've probably built this in these things at different times. There's a separation here where hasn't been built that firmly or retained well, so it's already separating. There's a gap, and there's a gap here. It's kind of tilting. Nice reflections in the rain and mist. Again, tilting signs. People have stuck stickers on the sign. I'm trying not to repeat myself here, but you can see that there's always stuff to harvest. People walking along in the rain, very similar observations. Different kinds of ramps. There's an edge that's been put on this driveway, and then it goes into another edge of this little garden where the trees and vegetation are in the summer. Similar to before. This one's in better focus, Paul. Beautiful reflections on the street. That would be good for color work. Not that many other observations except interesting cables, crossing the street as they do here. Let's see, are we at the end? No. Convenience store, very cool. The guy was looking at me going, why is that guy taking my picture? Because I stopped. And this is all interesting, junky stuff that you could play up, like the awning. It's been retracted for the winter, but this is what the awning comes out of. And I don't even know if this one's broken and if this one's missing, but I think I remember seeing awnings. All kinds of stuff with signs, bars on the windows. It's all kinds of great stuff you could use if you were designing this kind of store. And you'd amp it up a bit from that. More street things, street elements, signs on the street, markings, center markings. Are we at the end? Almost. Reverse angle on that store. Garbage bins, interesting. Stepping up. Don't just make a pathway, make the pathway up and down. There's a rock that's randomly there. Some nice winter shrubs or hedges that are lacking foliage. Branching pathway here that they repaved this summer, so the concrete's kind of new. And what else have we got? I just took this because I like this kind of Art Deco building entrance. What do you see over here? There's like a DirecTV or Bell satellite dish that's been put there on this old stone wall. So you've got old and new. Old wall, new dish, and it's not even on top of a building. I guess they figured they could still get the signal. Funny, but that's quirky and interesting and different. You've got vines here growing up cables and poles, wrapping around in a spiral, which is cool. Dead sod around the base of this pole. And you've got this vine, which is doing okay even in winter. You've got this fire hydrant, which has got some weird cables attached to it. That makes it a little different. Again, these are all observations of things that you might notice. Here's where my coffee cup from earlier came from. Somebody's left their coffee cup. But you could put whatever. And anytime you put something there, it's going to change the context. Like if somebody, left their watch there, or they dropped an article of clothing, or there was something even more significant, like, a broken open safe from some kind of cartoon, right? Then you'd go, oh, what's the meaning of that? Because it's X plus Y equals question mark. You've got setting plus something, and you're making conclusions from what you're looking at. Like the elements, what do they combine together to equal? That's what people are always doing when you're looking at each other, when you're looking at situations. So you can put that into background drawings. This is a walk up the street, up the hill, and you've got a big gathered pool of leaves here in an interesting shape. And as we round it out, I think I took this because these rocks, you notice that the wind is exposed. These like the leaves have all gathered, but the rocks, the tops have been exposed, I guess because the wind has blown them into the gaps between the rocks where they nestle in. So that's just an example of natural flow. The smaller stuff has settled in even further in, and then you've got this coating of the bigger leaves on top settling in these gaps. Here's an example of a driveway where at the end, the corner, the slab of the concrete is cracked off because of the cars passing over it. It's probably the pressure has snapped off this edge, and then you've got like this missing pieces here, and you've got this wall here that's plastered on this little wall. The plaster has started to crack off, and then you've got leaves gathered. So I'm going to go back now to my Photoshop, and I'm going to round this out with my notes. So this is the part where I read out my notes as I round out towards an hour, and people are welcome to take a snapshot of this, or if this is helpful to you. If it's not, well, then forget about it. But if this is helpful, I made these notes to summarize things, which I find it useful to do. So art snapshots and how to use them. Stock up your creative imagination, your mind's eye. I'm going to skip over this a bit, but I'm going to summarize it. Before you get into the nuts and bolts of drawing, you have to have a conception, something you visualize to then draw. So people usually jump into drawing. And sometimes you struggle to draw because you don't have a conception of what to draw. This is where these recipes and combinations of things can help. And this is where stocking your imagination can help, as I'm going to say here. This is where mental art snapshots can help. Sounds weird? It's not. The great artists of the past all knew this, but many modern ones are made lazy and too passive. We're all victims of this because of the overwhelming abundance of visual information from screens. Too many screens, even though I'm using screens right now. Thus, the assumption has become that an artist's image is of the same nature, like one you create would be the same as one of these ones just flowing by on screens. They've become kind of devalued because there's so many, such an abundance. It's like supply and demand. So artists assume that you can create a successful setting or character drawing simply by taking a photo and tracing it, which is not so, and hopefully that's maybe somewhat emerging from the things I've been saying in this video, that it's an act of synthesis and creation. It's not just a literal, just passive tracing. So learning to take mental art snapshots even when you're not drawing can be hugely useful in spurring creativity. This means active seeing. It means see, observe, remember. As I explained about the famous artist school, they had that motto. So it's not ordinary passive flow where you just relax and let everything wash over you and consume it passively. You engage and analyze and then remember it the best you can. You picture it drawing it later. So as I was walking up that hill with my groceries, I was thinking about making this video and trying to remember the ones that I showed at the beginning of it. I was picturing, what will I need to draw when I draw this later? What will I need to know? Is it square or round? Is it got this detail or that? And you can go a long way with this kind of thing, training your memory and putting it in your memory even when you don't have the tools. You kind of jump forward in time and think, what will I need to know? And then when you actually get later to sit down and draw, some of it should come back to you, especially if you practice this many times. You may not get it right away, but once you understand the principle, you can go from there and try and build up this skill. It's just like building up a muscle. So you memorize notes in a simple way, visual notes. It's a process of training the mind and memory for better drawing. Before learning to draw all the fancy stuff, which is the later thing, and it's, of course, a huge subject, like I say here, you need to learn to see more as you exist, Usually people just, I wrote thing, but it's think of the drawing, not what comes before it. So it's the raw material. It's all around us every day, but usually we don't notice it. And even if we notice it, we usually don't remember it. And even if we remember it, we don't distill lessons about nature and its laws from what we saw and then employ that in our work. So that goes into, when I say nature and its laws, it's all these things about looking at how reality forms itself, subject to, wind, people, the forces of nature, right? They all kind of warp and manipulate the settings around us. I think I've got a note about that on the next page. Every setting has a distinct character, just like a living being. The history of a setting's existence is revealed if you know how to examine it and extract useful observations. These can be used later. When you draw, they'll emerge and help you create unique images. Let's go to the end note. Focus and flows of nature and man affect a setting. Water, wind, smoke, man's activities, the stresses imposed on materials by nature and man. So, of course, these will be revealed by things like cracks, patches, weeds, growth, repairs, etc. They all show this. Don't make your drawings always too perfect. Star Wars example. By that I mean, Star Wars was one of the great things where they came out and changed course from earlier movies. They were always too perfect with gleaming spaceships and things. They showed you a weathered, lived-in reality that made you buy it. They sold it properly by adding all the cracks and flaws. So that's really what you see around us, is when you learn to read it, you see that the forces of life and the alterations of man, they all build up, and they're like a visual history or visual character that are in all the things around us. There's a story there, like every setting has its own story. So why do all this? Because you need a reservoir, something to draw from. It stocks your memory, and it expands your visual mental vocabulary. You can then use this and play with it. You can find variations. So once you have these things, you don't have to take them as is. You can try different combinations of elements. And the elements are like soup. It's like a recipe. Carrots and mushrooms and onions make one flavor. Chicken brings a different thing. Or you may make vegetable soup. Or, you see the point, right? Different combinations of ingredients make different characters. And even varying the different ingredients changes things. So once you understand it that way and don't just think of things in a fixed way, you can work your way into or out of interesting drawings, or you can fix a problem by thinking of variations. So as I round out here, this is a very different than the dead tracing mentality, the one that mistakenly assumes you will make great or original comics or art by just tracing photos. This will not work, and it will be unsatisfying to the viewer because the artist has not added something from their own mind and life. I mean, I guess that's a bit extreme. It's a bit hyperbolic, but I'm doing that on purpose. But it doesn't mean it won't work completely, but it might not be that unique or original. Like Simply tracing lines with no extra thought will not get you there, because there's sort of a repetitive nature to that when you work with 3D assets and photos and CGI and just kind of trace it. Like, it's usually not adding anything extra. What this tracing mentality reveals, this is my opinion, brutal, but I think true. It reveals a profound misunderstanding of what cartooning is. And comics is cartooning, not just traced illustrations. Cartooning is symbols used for communication and expression. Like, lines aren't real, right? It's all just lines and combinations of masses of lines and I'm not talking about like when you add color with tones and colors, but I'm saying that graphic cartooning with lines and masses of black, they're just symbols. They don't exist in nature, lines. That's like a very important thing to realize. It's a language of symbols. So cartooning consists of symbols used for communication and expression, to reveal the unseen, make a commentary, express the inexpressible, which is things that are difficult to express in words, and of course to tell a story and all the rest. But cartooning that way, as graphic symbols, it's much more interesting, and because it invites the viewer to participate in the decoding of the symbols. Thus it has life. Like, it's a synthesis, and the older comics had more symbolic cartooning, even the more realistic ones, more so-called realistic, like Neil Adams, or even people take Alex Toth as a realistic cartoonist, but he wasn't. He's a cartoonist. He's not really that realistic when you break that down. He just reused realistic proportions, but the rest of his work was very symbolic. So this gives it life, because the viewer has to synthesize from the lines and from the words in a comic, and it's putting all those together in their own mind as they view it. It creates the interest. But when you get too literal and too dead, and you're not adding anything from your own character, I think it's boring for people. Like, I can just relate from what I loved as a kid, looking at Joe Kubert versus Nick Cardy, John Romita, Jack Kirby. I'm going to forget lots of people, but they all had these unique flavors. Whereas now, too often what you see when people employ too many photos without adding anything and too many 3D assets, it's very dull. It's got a sameness to it. It's like that same sort of traced look. And that's not cartooning. I mean, you can do whatever you want. I said it in other videos. I'm not the art police. I'm just speaking from my point of view, what I like, what I've learned, and what I love to consume is when it doesn't even have to be that technically perfectly drawn, but if there's like a unique originality in character and creativity and an expression of a person's individuality, that's really what draws me into cartooning. Where's the end of my rant here? Yeah, it has life. It's an act of creation on the viewer's part, not only the artist. So the viewer, the consumer, the person looking at it has to create also. That's what cartooning draws you into doing, which is fun. It involves you. The literal tracing of photos and 3D assets is usually dead. That's the ranty part, because the artist has added little or nothing from their own life and spirit, and the viewer can tell the difference. True expressive cartooning, whether the subject is a character or a setting, I'm back, is an act of creation within the artist. To be able to do this, you must first feed your mind and understanding. That's where the notes come in, and that whole process. This is something you can decide to do actively even when you have no drawing materials. However, don't walk into traffic while you're noticing all this stuff. Important legal disclaimer, take art snapshots at your own risk. So yeah, if you're driving or whatever, don't take art snapshots except for momentary ones, because even though I'm joking, I'm kind of not joking. So I hope that was useful to people, and that you can see the point of this. Again, it's not to teach formulas. I really shy away from that. I think that there are some things that you can learn in drawing and creating that maybe have something of a formula, like how to construct a head or geometry, things like that. But when you come to the stage of it where you're expressing your own your own individual creations and thus your individuality, when you've learned to kind of think this way, that's really much more abundant. You can kind of play variations instead of just three notes. You've got a whole symphony, and you've got these different dials you can turn to try and adjust your drawing. So you're not just drawing one thing and repeating it. You're actually thinking in a much more flexible and fluid way. And again, that's where, when you're in the early stages of creating something and you're making your soup in your art kitchen, you're thinking, what am I going to throw in here to give it life? Where you've taken notes and things like this, you have something to draw on. Because as I started saying at the beginning, everything you're doing it's an act in the moment of drawing on the page and creating it spontaneously, but it's also drawing from your memory. So if you're drawing something like, say, a stable, like I was showing with those kids earlier, you're going to be trying to think of, well, what can I put in there to make it interesting? If you're concerned about making a good background, which I think is important in the kind of comics and animated films I love, where it's got a richer background. You can only draw from, if you're not looking at reference, you're in that moment, you can only go from your own memory. So this whole video is a plea for stalking your memory and how to do it, and how to try and be kind of more active as you're walking around in your daily life. You can still be an artist that way. You don't have to have a pen and paper. So thanks for watching. Please share this with people if you find it useful, and comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and as ever, we'll see you in the next one.